Have you ever noticed how your presence seems to change the atmosphere of a room without you trying to do anything at all? You walk in quietly, you're not performing, you're not competing, you're just there. And yet something shifts. Some people relax around you almost instantly. They open up, they talk more freely, they feel understood without having to explain themselves. But at the same time, there's another reaction happening, just as real, but far less obvious. Some people don't know why they feel slightly uncomfortable around you. They might act polite, even friendly, but there's a tension underneath it, a subtle distance, a quiet resistance that doesn't match their words. And if you're an empath, you've probably felt this contradiction your whole life. Here's what's actually going on. Your emotional awareness makes things visible that other people are used to keeping hidden. Not because you're trying to expose anyone, but because you naturally pick up what others ignore, suppress, or avoid. And in psychology, when someone feels seen in a way they didn't choose, it can create two reactions. One is connection, the other is discomfort, because your clarity becomes a mirror. And not everyone is comfortable with what they see in it. So today, we're going to break down a deeper truth. Why empathic people naturally attract both admiration and hidden resentment, and how to understand it without shrinking yourself, overthinking, or absorbing emotions that were never yours to carry. There's a subtle dynamic most empaths never consciously learn, yet they experience it constantly in real life. You don't just move through the world as a passive observer of people. You move through it as a signal. And one of the strongest signals you unconsciously broadcast is emotional availability. Now, emotional availability here doesn't mean you are emotionally open in a simplistic sense. It's deeper than that. It's the way your nervous system responds to other people's emotional states in real time. It's the micro adjustments in your tone, your attention, your facial expression, your patience, your timing. It's the sense people get often within seconds that they can be felt by you. And human beings are incredibly sensitive to that. Before logic ever kicks in, before conversation even develops, the nervous system of another person is already scanning you for something very basic. Can I be myself around this person? Most people don't realize how fast this assessment happens. It's not intellectual. It's biological. It's emotional pattern recognition happening below awareness. When you are an empathic type, you often answer that question in a way that feels like yes to others. Not because you say the right words, but because your presence communicates receptivity. You don't interrupt emotional expression as quickly. You don't shut down discomfort immediately. You don't look away when someone shifts into vulnerability. You stay present longer than most people are used to, and that creates a very specific effect. For emotionally balanced individuals, your presence feels like relief. They don't have to overthink their expression. They don't have to edit themselves as much. They can relax into the interaction because they sense that emotional authenticity won't be punished or dismissed. So they naturally gravitate toward you. They open up faster. They trust the space more easily, sometimes even too easily. But here's where the complexity begins. Not everyone who recognizes emotional availability is seeking healthy connection. Some people are emotionally organized. Others are emotionally chaotic, avoidant, or dependent. And they are also constantly scanning their environment for emotional safe zones, where they can release what they cannot regulate themselves. To them, your openness doesn't just register as warmth. It registers as access. And access, psychologically speaking, is powerful. Because if someone senses that you can tolerate emotional expression, they may also assume, consciously or unconsciously, that you can absorb emotional expression, that you will stay engaged when things get heavy, that you will listen beyond your limits, that you will not easily withdraw when emotional intensity rises. So what begins as genuine connection in one context can turn into emotional extraction in another. And this is where many empaths become confused about their relationships. They notice a pattern. People open up quickly, lean on them emotionally, and then sometimes disappear or become distant or fail to reciprocate the same level of emotional presence. It feels inconsistent, even unfair. But the mechanism behind it is not random. It's based on how emotional availability is being interpreted by different psychological types. To emotionally stable people, your openness feels like connection. To emotionally unstable people, your openness can feel like permission to unload, permission to project, permission to bypass their own internal regulation by using your presence as a stabilizing surface. And over time, if there are no boundaries, this creates imbalance, not because you intended it. Not because you invited it consciously, because your nervous system communicates something that your words never explicitly define. This is why awareness is so important here, because once you understand that emotional availability is a signal, not just a trait, you start to see interactions differently. You realize that people are not only responding to what you say or do, but to what they believe they can emotionally access through you. And that changes everything about how you move. You don't become less empathetic. You become more selective with where your empathy is fully engaged. You learn to notice when connection is mutual and when it quietly shifts into imbalance. And most importantly, you stop interpreting every emotional pull toward you as a sign of compatibility. Sometimes it's just recognition of access. There is a psychological reality that many sensitive people slowly discover through experience rather than explanation. Not everyone interprets your presence in the same emotional way. When you carry a certain level of emotional awareness, when you naturally pick up on tone, mood shifts, and unspoken tension, you tend to assume that others experience you in a similar way, but they don't. And this difference is where most of the confusion begins. Your light, in this context, is not something mystical. It's a combination of presence, emotional clarity, attentiveness, and the ability to stay psychologically engaged with what is real in the moment. You notice what others miss. You register inconsistencies in behavior. You sense emotional undercurrents before they are spoken out loud. To some people, this feels grounding. It feels like safety. They don't have to over-explain themselves. They don't have to constantly manage how they are being perceived. Your presence allows them to relax their internal monitoring system, even if just a little. But for another category of people, the exact same presence creates a very different internal experience. It creates exposure. Not exposure in a literal sense, but psychological exposure, the feeling of being more seen than they are comfortable with. And this is where things become interesting, because most people don't consciously recognize when they feel exposed. They just feel a shift. That shift can show up as slight irritation, defensiveness, sudden detachment, over-control of behavior, or even unnecessary politeness that feels slightly artificial. None of these reactions are usually intentional. They are adaptive responses from a nervous system that is trying to restore a sense of control. Because when someone is not fully at ease with themselves, when there are unresolved insecurities, internal contradictions, or emotional patterns they avoid acknowledging, being around someone perceptive can feel destabilizing, not because you are judging them, but because you are noticing them. And being noticed is not always experienced as comfort. Sometimes it is experienced as pressure, especially for individuals who rely heavily on social masks, emotional suppression, or controlled self-presentation. These patterns help them function in daily life, but they also create a distance between their internal state and their external expression. When someone like you enters the interaction, someone who naturally picks up on emotional inconsistency, that distance becomes more noticeable to them. And what becomes noticeable internally is often uncomfortable. So instead of processing that discomfort consciously, the mind redirects it. It attaches it to something external. Sometimes it becomes, I don't like their energy. Sometimes it becomes, they are too intense. Sometimes it becomes, something feels off about them. But underneath those interpretations, what is often happening is simpler. Your clarity is disrupting their emotional hiding patterns. And disruption is not always welcomed by the psyche, even when it is harmless or neutral in intention. This is why the same person can be deeply liked by one group and subtly resisted by another, without any clear external reason. The difference is not your behavior. It is the internal structure of the people you are interacting with. People who are comfortable with themselves tend to feel expanded around you. They don't experience your awareness as judgment. They experience it as understanding. There is no need to defend, correct, or adjust. They can simply be. But people who are not comfortable with themselves often experience your presence as something that reveals too much, even when nothing explicit is being revealed. It's the feeling of being emotionally perceived at a level they are not used to, and that can trigger subtle resistance. This is where many empaths interpret what is happening. They assume that discomfort in others must mean they did something wrong, said something wrong, or are somehow too much in their natural state, so they begin adjusting, softening, shrinking, over-explaining, trying to become less noticeable, less intense, less triggering. But the truth is, the reaction was never fully about them as individuals. It was about what their presence activated in the other person's internal landscape. Once you understand this, the emotional burden shifts. You stop personalizing every shift in energy. You stop trying to edit your natural presence to accommodate every reaction. And you start recognizing a more grounded reality. Your presence does not create people's insecurity. It simply makes existing insecurity harder to ignore. What many people miss in these dynamics is that hidden resentment rarely starts as resentment. It usually starts as comparison. And comparison is one of the most automatic psychological processes in human behavior. People don't always choose to compare themselves. They simply do it when they are exposed to traits, behaviors, or emotional qualities that stand out in their environment. When someone encounters an empathic presence, someone who is emotionally aware, attentive, and naturally responsive, what they often experience first is not hostility. It's a quiet internal measurement. How do I feel about myself in the presence of this person? This question is not spoken. It is not logical. It happens beneath awareness. And depending on the answer, two different emotional paths begin to form. If the person feels internally secure, comparison becomes neutral or even inspiring. They might notice your emotional clarity and feel curious about it. They might appreciate the depth or feel comfortable engaging more authentically. There is no threat in the comparison because their self-worth is not dependent on outperforming you emotionally. But if the person is carrying insecurity, especially unprocessed insecurity, comparison becomes uncomfortable, not immediately aggressive, but subtly destabilizing, because your emotional presence highlights something they are already sensitive about, their own lack of self-connection, emotional awareness, or authenticity. And this is where projection begins. Instead of consciously acknowledging, this person is more emotionally present than I am, the mind looks for a more manageable interpretation. The discomfort needs a direction. It needs an explanation that preserves self-image. So the discomfort gets redirected outward. It becomes, they are too sensitive. They are intense. They think they are deeper than everyone else. There is something off about them. Notice what is happening here psychologically. The mind is not describing you accurately. It is trying to regulate internal discomfort by reframing the source of it. And if this process repeats over time, especially in repeated interactions, the emotional tone can shift from simple discomfort into something more stable and ingrained. That's where resentment can quietly form, not as a conscious decision, but as a learned emotional association. Your presence internal discomfort, and the mind, in an attempt to protect itself, begins to develop resistance toward the source of that discomfort. But here's the important nuance. This resentment is not always obvious, even to the person experiencing it. It can stay completely unconscious, showing up only through behavior rather than awareness. For example, they may become slightly competitive in conversation, trying to subtly reassert themselves. They may minimize your input without realizing it. They may alternate between friendliness and emotional distance, or they may maintain surface-level politeness while emotionally disengaging. From the outside, it looks inconsistent, but internally, it is often a simple attempt to restore psychological balance. Because being around someone who feels emotionally clear can create an uncomfortable contrast for someone who is not internally aligned. And humans are highly sensitive to contrast. We notice when someone seems more grounded, more present, more emotionally regulated, even if it's not explicitly stated. And that comparison can quietly challenge self-perception. Now, here is where empaths often misinterpret the situation. They assume the shift in behavior is about something they did. So they start analyzing their words, their tone, their actions. They replay interactions, trying to locate the mistake that caused the change. But in many cases, there is no specific mistake. What changed was not your behavior. It was the other person's internal experience of themselves in relation to you. And that distinction is critical because once comparison turns into discomfort and discomfort turns into projection, your presence is no longer being evaluated objectively. It is being filtered through emotional self-protection. This is also why some people remain consistently drawn to you while others seem subtly resistant over time. It is not randomness, it is internal compatibility with emotional clarity. People who are comfortable with themselves don't need to reduce your presence in order to feel balanced. But people who are still navigating internal insecurity often do, even if only subtly and unconsciously. So what looks like hidden resentment is often not personal dislike at all. It is unresolved self-comparison that has not been consciously processed. And once you understand that, you stop interpreting every shift in energy as a reflection of your value. You start seeing it more accurately. Some people are meeting you, and some people are meeting themselves through you and struggling with what they see. Empathy is often treated like a pure strength, something inherently good that only needs to be expressed more. But in reality, empathy without structure is not just a strength. It is a liability in certain environments. The difference between emotional intelligence and emotional exposure comes down to one thing: boundaries. Without boundaries, empathy becomes a constant emotional leak. You are not just understanding people, you are absorbing them. Their tone starts influencing your mood. Their stress starts sitting in your body. Their confusion starts becoming your mental noise. And over time, you lose the ability to clearly distinguish what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else. This is where many empaths quietly struggle. On the surface, they appear calm, thoughtful, even composed. But internally, there is a continuous processing of other people's emotional states happening in the background. It is like running too many programs at once. Nothing visibly crashes immediately, but the system slowly drains. And the reason this happens is because empathy naturally pulls you toward connection. You notice discomfort in others and feel inclined to respond. You notice tension and want to ease it. You notice emotional shifts and instinctively try to stabilize them. But here is the key misunderstanding. Not every emotional signal you perceive is meant to be resolved by you. Some emotions in other people are not requests for help. They are simply states they are moving through. But without boundaries, the empath interprets every emotional signal as involvement, as responsibility, as something to carry. And this is where sensitivity starts turning into vulnerability. Because when you continuously engage with emotional states that are not yours to hold, your internal system stops prioritizing your own grounding. Your attention becomes externally directed most of the time. You are tracking others more than you are tracking yourself. That shift is subtle but powerful. Over time, you may notice certain patterns. Feeling drained after social interaction, difficulty identifying your own emotional baseline, or a sense that your mood is overly influenced by who you were just around. These are not signs of weakness. They are signs of blurred emotional boundaries. Now contrast that with emotional intelligence supported by boundaries. In that state, you still notice everything. You still read people accurately. You still sense emotional undercurrents. But there is a clear internal separation. I can see this, but I do not have to carry this. That separation changes everything, because observation without absorption creates clarity, but observation with absorption creates overload. Boundaries are what convert emotional perception into usable information instead of emotional weight. They allow you to stay aware without becoming entangled. And this is where true strength develops, not in shutting empathy off, but in learning where it stops. A strong empath does not become less sensitive. They become more precise with their sensitivity. They start recognizing the difference between connection and emotional dependency, between understanding someone and taking responsibility for their emotional regulation, between being present and being pulled in. Without this distinction, empathy can easily turn into emotional overfunctioning, where you are constantly adjusting yourself to stabilize the emotional atmosphere around you. You become the listener, the absorber, the regulator, the one who holds space for everyone else, often at the expense of your own internal stability. And over time, that role becomes exhausting because no system, psychological or biological, is designed to carry continuous external emotional load without recovery. Boundaries are the recovery mechanism. They are what allow you to reset after interaction. They are what allow you to stay emotionally present without becoming emotionally entangled. They are what allow you to care without collapsing into over-involvement. And perhaps most importantly, boundaries protect the integrity of your perception. Because when you are not overloaded, you see people more clearly. You are not filtering them through fatigue, emotional saturation, or unconscious reaction. You are observing rather than absorbing. This clarity also changes how others experience you. When you are no longer overextending emotionally, people begin to meet you differently. Those who relied on unconscious emotional extraction may find less access. Those who value genuine connection may feel a more stable presence, and interactions become more defined, less confusing, and less emotionally chaotic. So the real transformation is not becoming less empathic, it is becoming structurally grounded. Because empathy without boundaries is emotional vulnerability. But empathy with boundaries becomes perception. And perception, when it is clean and undistorted, becomes power, not over others, but within yourself. So here's what it really comes down to. Not everyone who reacts strongly to you is reacting to you as you are. A lot of the time, they're reacting to what you bring out in them, things they've ignored, suppressed, or never learned how to deal with. And when you start seeing it from that angle, everything becomes clearer. You stop personalizing confusion. You stop over-explaining your presence. And you stop shrinking yourself just to make emotionally unstable dynamics feel easier for other people, because your sensitivity was never the problem. The real shift happens when you learn this difference. Being aware of others is a strength, but carrying others is a burden. You can understand people deeply without absorbing them. You can stay open without becoming exposed. And you can remain kind without losing your internal ground. And once you reach that level of awareness, something changes in how people experience you too. The right people feel calm around you. The wrong ones naturally distance themselves. And the confusing reactions in between start to make sense instead of controlling your self-perception. So instead of asking, why do people react to me like this? You start asking a more powerful question. What is mine to carry? And what was never mine in the first place? Because that's where emotional clarity begins. And that's where your real strength quietly takes shape.